Three items on the agenda today for committee of the whole. The first one is the community survey results.
Yes, thank you guys for having me. I'm Nathan Wiggin. I am a research director at Northwest Research Group. We are the ones who performed the 2015 and the 2017 resident survey. We're just going to take about 20 minutes and run through a high-level view of all of the results. I understand that most, if not all of you, have had the opportunity to take a look at the report. And towards the end of this presentation, I am going to reference something that's on the report that's not in this presentation, just it's a bit too much to talk through. But it's a good section to really kind of dig down into and look at. So, as you probably know, Renton's conducted several resident surveys in 2008, 2011, 2015, and now 2017. And you do them for a variety of reasons, but it's primarily just to continue benchmarking your performance and to gain deeper insight into, how your residents feel you guys are performing as a city, how you're delivering services, in the direction that the city is headed. So we conducted it, as I said, in 2015 and in 2017. And in 2015, we introduced a fairly new methodology, address-based sampling with appending telephone numbers, landline and cell phone. We kept the same basic methodology, but with all things in life, technology has improved since then. So we added a third step to this. So using the same basic methodology, we pulled a random sample of about 15,000 addresses within the city limits of Renton. We sent that out to a vendor and said, please append any of the following information. Cell phone number, if you got it, a landline number, if you got it, and an email address, if you have an email address associated with that physical address. So that gave us a couple of different ways to reach out to people. If they had an email address, we started emailing them, asking them to participate in the survey. Then we would follow them up with a phone call if they didn't. If they had a phone number, we would start calling them and asking them to participate in the survey. If they didn't have any of that information, we would send them a physical letter with a link to the survey and a 1-800 number saying you can call in and participate. And we would send a reminder, the same basic letter, just a reminder. The survey was available in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. And the culmination of our efforts resulted in about 524 completed surveys over the course of about the 3 to 4 week data collection period, 4 week.
Real quick before you move on.
Yeah.
How were the languages selected? I understand English and Spanish. How did you select Vietnamese?
Do you remember how specifically we selected Vietnamese?
The largest minority represented in the demographics.
It's tough when you get into a variety of languages, because what generally happens when you start digging into the census data, especially in the United States, is you'll get English and then Spanish, and then a whole host of other languages that make up somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population in terms of they speak that language and they speak English less than very well, and it costs a lot of money to be able to translate and prepare things and get them online, so we just picked the biggest block.
Okay. Please continue.
So we made a very large effort to try to get a hold of minority residents within Renton, because we know that you're a minority-majority community. And so we did multiple things. As we mentioned, we translated the survey into Spanish and Vietnamese. As we were doing the poll of the addresses, we also asked our vendor to append any type of information that they would have discussing demographics or race. We would pull that information and we would flag it and say, okay, more than likely this is a not white alone household or not white alone address. We also ran all of the addresses versus the census data, and based off of population densities of minority residents would flag them as well. So any census block, for example, with greater than 60% minority residents, we would flag and say this is something to pay particular attention to, try to get a hold of those people. We did what's called oversampling based off of minority status. So what is it in here? 51, where's my specific number? 53% of the population is considered not white alone. So we sent out about 60% of our invitations, and about roughly 60% of our outreach was geared towards trying to reach those non-white alone households. In addition to all of this, we ordered what's called targeted sample. So not only did we get these 15,000 records and get the information appended to it, but we also reached out to our vendor and said, hey, can you provide us with additional records to try to get some additional minority residents so we could do everything that we can. Despite this plethora of methods in trying to reach out and get as much information from a diverse population as we could, we only managed to reach about 30% of our sample size was considered a non-white alone, were considered non-white alone residents. So it was short of our goal, despite all of our attempts. And the prevailing theory, and we've had this problem a couple times over about the past year or so with resident surveys, the prevailing theory is if you are a non-English speaking or minority resident in the United States today and you get a phone call from someone going, hi, my name is Nathan, I'm from the government, I would like to talk to you, there's a little bit of distrust there. And that's our theory, and we're trying to figure out what to do to get around that. So what we ended up doing, and we always do this, we always weight data. And weighting data it's a common tool used in research, and basically what we do is we use it to adjust our sample size and our sample population to match the actual population in terms of age, gender, race, etc. So we did weight the data, and the good news is even though we had a weight up from 30 to about 53% in terms of minority, it didn't make any real changes. You'll see a series of about 5 randomly polled questions from throughout the report and throughout the data. And what you're basically seeing is, all of the data that's completely unweighted, completely raw, versus the weighted data on the left-hand side of each of these two charts. And then on the right-hand side of each of these charts, we're giving you that same information, but only looking at minority populations, so these non-white alone residents. We're showing you the unweighted versus the weighted data. And the reason we put this slide in here, and you guys are the first people I've did it for, and now I do it for everyone because it's a great slide, is to show you that weighting doesn't really make much of a difference. We're not weighting the data and suddenly you're going from a population being very unsatisfied to very satisfied. You're talking of a movement of about 1 to 2 percentage points at most. So I'm going to go through this next section rather quickly. At the beginning of nearly every survey, we ask 5 basic questions designed to gather an overall impression on how things are going in the city. We run it through a spiffy formula, and then we come up with a 5-star rating. You think of how hotels are rated from 1 to 5 stars. We do something similar. So the 5 questions are overall quality of life. It's how would you rate the overall quality of life in Renton? And as you see, Renton does pretty well. And you've done well consistently. You'll see this is actually a theme going throughout this report. From 2015 to 2017, things are fairly steady. There are a few areas where things have improved. There's 1 or 2 areas where things have not improved so much, but for the most part, things are fairly steady. And as a general rule of thumb, that's pretty good news. So don't think that this is bad, that things are remaining steady. This isn't a corporation where you're always trying to shoot for 10s and raise your scores. That's not realistic. And we also benchmark a lot of these results, and you can see the chart at the bottom is the result of the benchmarks, and you're performing similar to most other benchmarks, nationally, regionally, and other 4-star communities. You're performing at about the same level in terms of how your residents view the overall quality of life. Similar story with the overall quality of city services. About 2/3 of residents say that the quality is meeting or exceeding their expectations, and you're performing quite well compared to benchmarks. Again, just above national, regional, and 4-star benchmarks. Good news with this comparison to other communities, you have about 2/3 of your residents who say that Renton is somewhat or significantly better than other communities, and this has actually increased compared to 2015. And it is, like the other ones, performing very similar to benchmarks. A note on this specific question is we do not ask them what communities they're comparing it to. It is simply compared with other cities and towns, how would you rate Renton as a place to live? So it is completely subjective. It is designed to be subjective. We're not going to say, compared to Kent or compared to Seattle, or compared to Bellevue. We want people to say, just compared to what you've heard, how would you rate renting compared to elsewhere? It's, stay here or move is kind of how you think of it. We ask a question that is normally very divisive, and it's not necessarily so divisive in Renton, which is actually good news. And that's the direction that the city is headed. You have the option of a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is it's strongly headed in the wrong direction, 10 is strongly headed in the right direction. You have about half, a little over half of your residents who feel that Renton is headed in the right direction, which doesn't sound like much, but you only have a very small portion of residents who feel that Renton is heading in the wrong direction, and you have about a third who just say, yeah, I'm happy with it. It's just doing what it's doing. They're kind of like the no opinion people. I mentioned that this is a strongly divisive question because in most cities where I run this question, you will have about 50-ish% say that they're heading in the right direction, and then about 35 to 40% saying in the wrong direction, and then like 10% or something along those lines in the middle. It's just wildly skewed. So having a generally positive outlook is something that's positive. So generally people think you're going in the right direction. People don't see anything big wrong with the direction that the city is going, and that's what you should take away. The final of these 5 questions has to deal with value of services. I like to think of this as a taxation question without using the word taxation. The wording is, thinking about the services and facilities in Renton, do you feel that you're getting your money's worth for them or not? And you'll see that, just over half of the residents say that they're getting their money's worth, a little over a third say meh, and again, only about 1 in 8 or so say that they're not getting their money's worth. The reason I call this a taxation type question without the words is because we're really basically asking them, you pay the government money, how do you feel that they're spending it? This normally rates lowest for most cities, and one of the reasons we found through doing a lot of follow-up research in these community studies is that people don't necessarily understand how much of their tax dollars go towards cities versus counties versus state versus federal. So when you're paying property tax, the average person doesn't have any idea how much of that goes to Renton versus goes to the state. Good luck when the tax rates rise. Sorry. So all of this comes together in creating a 5-star rating. Right? And it's basically, it goes from 1/2, 1, it's done in half-star increments, from 1 to 5. 5, in all honesty, is considered a utopia. I've never seen and do not ever expect to see a 5-star city. 4.5 star is really, realistically, the highest I anticipate ever seeing. I've seen it once. It was your neighbor to the north, Bellevue, but we did data collection during the Super Bowl. And that's our reason why, because they've never been a 5-star before. They were right after the Super Bowl, and then they went right back down. I got to tell that joke in Colorado. Much worse reception. So this spider graph is just kind of giving you an overall view of the past slides. This is your overall rating. You guys are the red line, and how you kind of compare to other benchmark communities. As we just discussed, you're pretty solidly a 4-star city. On 4 out of the 5 measures, you're right there in solid 4-star level. Comparability to other communities, as I mentioned, is a little lower than other benchmarks, but it is coming up compared to where it was a few years ago. So you're doing well, you're seeing some improvements. Okay, so now into a little bit more meat. We asked a whole series of questions, and we're not going to get into each of these questions because I think at the end of the day it was about 120 total. But we categorized them. So we have these 9 questions that have to deal with general livability. And what I'm showing you here is the year-over-year change in the mean score. 8 out of the 9 are basically the same. The small changes are within the margin of error. The 9th one is having a vibrant downtown. While that's still the lowest rating, you'll notice that little green arrow. That means that it's come up. And I recall when I was here a couple years ago giving a presentation, there was a lot of talk about ways of revitalizing downtown. In my mind, this is basically saying that that's being recognized. There's still work to do, but something's being recognized because it's showing a real improvement outside the margin of error. We also asked several questions about diversity and inclusion. This is the first of 2 slides. There's 2 things. One is We talk about openness and inclusiveness, and the question text is, how would you rate Renton's openness and willingness to include people of diverse backgrounds? And nearly everyone says that the city is doing a good or excellent job regarding this. The second question is, how would you rate the job the Renton government does to reach out and include its diverse cultural and language populations? This as well is doing fairly well. About 2/3 of the residents believe that the city is doing a good or excellent job here. You'll notice that there is some difference by race, and this is where things got a little interesting when you delved into the data. I'm able to look at 2015 versus 2017, and then I'm able to look at the change in the 2 years based off of different demographics. So what we're seeing is, when you're looking at your minority populations or your non-white alone, that there is a slight uptick, right, between 2015 and 2017. It's not statistically significant, but you're seeing a slight uptick. And when you look at your white alone population, you're actually seeing an increase in people saying that Renton is doing a good job at reaching out to and including its diverse cultural populations. Kind of an interesting finding. I'm not entirely sure what explains it. Also on diversity and inclusion, we ask about the familiarity and the use of services. You'll see that it's fairly high. People are relatively familiar with it. The takeaway here is the people who you would expect to be familiar with these services, your elderly residents and your lower income residents, are the people who are more familiar with this and also are the people who use it more often. That's the basic gist. Activities and events. It could be that I've been on a Parks and Rec kick lately, but these are some of my favorite slides because they're fun. It's no surprise. It's this way in almost every city. You see about 9 out of 10 households. Almost every household has visited a park in the past 12 months. They're very, very popular, not only here, they're very popular everywhere. What you're seeing is just over half of residents have said that they have visited a city-run trail. This is a new question in 2017 specifically added, so sadly I don't have anything to compare it to, but it was kind of interesting that many residents say that they've done a city-run trail. Something that I think has kind of occurred as a flip-flop between 2015 and 2017 is there's been a decrease in households who have visited a farmer's market or a downtown event, but at the same time a correlating increase in people who say that they've attended some type of neighborhood picnic. I can't tell you that these are the same people because we didn't sample the same people from year over year, but it's pretty close, in the shift from one to the other. And it's just something I said that's kind of interesting. Maybe the downtown events have changed. Maybe there are more neighborhood events going on and people are choosing to stick around their neighborhood as opposed to go downtown. As a general rule, people like activities. They like special events. They feel that they bring a lot of value to the community. They feel that they build a sense of community. They feel that they're a good use of resources. And a new question is they feel that these activities highlight Renton's diversity. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the park section, people like events. People like things to do. And they feel that they're doing a good job here. Safety. Again, you're basically seeing the same thing as we saw in 2015. Ratings of safety are fairly steady. They're fairly high across the board. This is on a 5-point scale. So when you're looking at these means, it's going from 1 to 5. And you kind of see what you would expect to see for the most part with your nighttime safety being rated slightly lower than your daytime safety. The one thing we noticed in 2015 that we continue to see in 2017 is what is it about trail safety? I wouldn't necessarily expect to see trail safety lower in the list. So a possible way to look at this in the future is we could split it up into day versus night, or something we could think about is asking for those who don't feel necessarily so safe in trails, where, what trails? Unless city planners or you guys have some specific idea why there might be a lower rating for trail safety. We could dig into that a little more in the future. The police department, confidence is high. People feel that people feel that the police are able to respond to emergencies in a very, very timely manner. They believe that the police officers here in Renton consistently enforce the law, and they believe that the police officers in Renton are approachable. It's held consistent from year over year, and it's fairly consistent across all demographic groups. There's no differences based off of age, gender, race, income, any of those. They're all basically the same. So you're getting consistently high scores for the police department. Emergency preparedness. I like to call this section the I think I do, but I really don't. What we're basically seeing here is you have a lot of people consistently in both years who say that they are prepared, either somewhat or very prepared for a major emergency. And they have 5 to 7 days worth of food and supplies. But when you ask them of their knowledge of emergency programs and emergency preparedness in Renton, you have a very large portion of people who don't really know what the city is doing. You guys are the only ones who ask this question. I have tried to sneak it into 2 other cities because I don't think that you're unique here, but I can't confirm it. I'll give a personal anecdote. I, for several years, have been part of King County Search and Rescue. I would consider myself fairly ready for an emergency. I have no idea what emergency programs are in place in Seattle. So that could possibly be what the situation is. Everyone's favorite topic is traffic. There's really not much that needs to be said here. If there is a low mark, and I don't think that this is representative of Renton individually as much as it is the region as a whole, just about everything involving traffic is, below the midline of 2.5 on a scale from 1 to 5. That's consistent. And what's interesting about this is, we do other cities in the region. You're not alone. When we ask open-ended questions across the nation, what are the #1 problems, or what are the biggest problems in your city today? It is almost universally split between traffic and growth, no matter where you are. Those are always the 2 big issues. The fun thing is when it's split between growth, you have about half the people who say it's growing too fast, and the other half the people saying it's growing too slow. All you can do in terms of traffic is pray. Regarding utilities and maintenance, we're seeing that overall residents feel that Renton is doing a good job. You're doing a good job. There's a couple questions in here that aren't necessarily about delivering clean water. And the top one you should look at is providing access to and preservation of open space. Kind of an environmental question. So what was interesting about that is, although by just a smidgen, it is the highest rated question out of this, where people feel that having that access is better for them, or they feel that the city is doing best at providing access. So it's almost like a proxy for importance here, to some degree. Code enforcement, that's an area that could use some improvement. It's about the same. Everything here is basically the same as it was in 2015. You're seeing 8 out of 10 residents believe that dilapidated dilapidated properties are a problem around the city. A little over half say that they're a problem in their neighborhood. You'll see a map on the next page that kind of outlines this sub-bullet point of where. And code enforcement efforts, people aren't necessarily very happy with them. It's a tough thing to deal with code enforcement. And when we look at specifically where we're seeing the biggest issues with code enforcement, we've got City Center, Highlands, and Benson are the ones that have the highest percentage of saying a major problem, like code enforcement issues are. Okay, just a couple more slides.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So on the code enforcement map here, you have percentages like West Hill 9% and downtown 21%. Is that percentage based off the entire total?
It's the percentage, hold on, I have to think of how to phrase this. The percentage of residents in that neighborhood who feel that dilapidated properties are a major problem in their
Okay.
neighborhood.
Based off who you surveyed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Based off of your survey.
Yes, yes. So,
think- was
for
that the
example,
crux
if
of
we
your question?
surveyed
Yeah, that
100
answers
people
the
from
question.
Highlands, right, 12 out of those 100 people said that it's a major problem.
Okay.
On to civic engagement. This is also kind of interesting because what we're seeing is, you have about a third of residents have said that they've volunteered, for some cause in their neighborhood, which is actually pretty uplifting. And in addition to that, you have about 6% say that someone else in their household has volunteered for something. And then I know this number often feels lower or feels higher than it is for people who work in the city, but only about 20% of the residents have reached out and actually had a conversation with city matters with someone from the city. About 3% say that someone else in their household has. People get information from a wide variety of sources. Renton's website was number 2 and is now number 1. It's kind of swapped places with the Renton Reporter and Renton City News, which have kind of gone down in use. Social media has actually gone up in the past couple of years. But you're seeing here that there's actually a large difference in where people get their information, and nobody just relies on one piece of information anymore. They're kind of going out there everywhere. And this will continue to shift. In 2 years, I promise it'll be something completely different. But the point is, you just got to take all of the avenues that you can to develop a completely comprehensive outreach. Government vision and involvement. As a general rule of thumb, your residents think that you're doing a good job listening to and informing them, informing the residents in 3 out of these 4 areas. And what's the 3 out of the 4 areas is there's been improvement. And this is actually something that's kind of cool. This is where the employees and the council members and the people directly related to the city of Renton actually have a direct impact. This isn't a policy that's being passed. This isn't, some measure that's being taken into place. This is how well do the residents feel that you guys as council members and you guys as employees are doing at creating and disseminating a clear vision for the city's future. That's what this is measuring. How well is the city doing at keeping your residents informed? How well are you guys up at this table doing at seeking residents' input and involvement? And how well are you doing at listening to residents? So this slide and these specific questions directly speak to the people in this room and the people who work in this building. And the improvements there directly speak to something that you guys have done over the past 2 years, where either your efforts are being recognized or you've made changes in the way that you're acting about your residents. But when it comes down to what is the biggest thing that you guys can do in the room, it's to focus on what you can do. On a similar vein, what we're seeing is that, a little under half, about 40% of residents actually have had contact with city employees. And as a general rule of thumb, when they run into these employees and they talk to them, either whether it's to pay a speeding ticket or get a building permit, the city's doing a pretty good job. They're pretty happy with the employees that they interact with when they have to interact with employees. So that's it for the bulk of the presentation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to kind of touch on something that was in the report. It's just a little much to talk to in a slide. But you're going to see on page basically 52 in the full physical report, it's going to be a big old chart like this. It's a big matrix. Take some time to familiarize yourselves with the matrix. And a couple pages before it goes into a pretty detailed full page, actually it's multi-page explanation of how this is put together. The long and short of this is, if you want to move from, say, a 4 to a 4.5 star community, or you want to really get that higher quality of life for your residents, this tells you in one complicated chart, what specific areas you can focus on. It's just a lot of stuff to talk to, and there's a solid wall of text the page before, and then another wall of text about 4 pages before that, and another wall of text about 6 pages before that. It's, all in all, it makes up about 12 pages in the report that kind of sums up into this chart. But if you get the chance, go through and read that section. It's called Key Drivers and Key Community Indicators. It's just a very important piece that it just takes a long time to talk through. Do I have any questions?
Any questions from council? I don't see any, so thank you.
Thank you guys for having me.
All right. Excuse me. We are going to move on to item number 2 on our agenda, small cellular wireless facilities. Jennifer, is that you?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Good evening, President Prince and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Jennifer Henning with Community and Economic Development, and with me is Brittany Port, a consultant that the city retained from AHBL to help us with this piece of work or this body of work, and it was a very big lift, I have to say. Just a bit of an anecdote. I've worked here a long time, as you know, and some 23 years ago, I remember going to the Planning Commission and saying the information highway was coming to town. And we were all trying to wrap our heads around what the information highway was, and we were writing policies around that. And then in 1989, we started realizing that people had these car phones and these big phones they carried around with them, and we needed to have regulations to help control where the antennas that were needed to make those work could go. And so we had a portion of our code we drafted called the Wireless Communication Facility Regulations. That was back in 1998. And we amended those in 2002, and we amended them again in 2015 to try and keep up with some of the technology that was coming our way. But those wireless communication facility regulations really were just for the large cell poles you see, cellular towers, lattice towers, the faux trees you might see when you travel, for the things that are along primarily highway and freeway corridors and such, and they cover a really large area. They didn't talk about the small cell facilities that we're talking to you about tonight. So the original macro facilities, the ones that you see on the left are these large cell towers, lattice towers, and their rooftop installations. Those cover big areas. And what we're talking about are smaller facilities that cover a small area. So KUOW did a story last spring, and they estimated that small cell facilities will be deployed in the U.S. to the tune of 250,000 of these antennas that are needed over the next few years. And this is to accommodate the fourth and fifth generation of cellular service. So 1G service was analog phones, and 2G was digital phones, and we're working with 3 and 4G right now, which has to do with voice and data. So 5G, just to let you know, is super fast data processing, essentially. And what might take several minutes to download right now, say a movie you want to download could take several minutes. When we get to 5G in a couple of years, it'll take a couple of seconds or a portion of a second. And so what we're talking about with small cells, it's not a coverage issue, it's a capacity issue. So voice calls almost always get through, but if you're downloading something, it may be interrupted because too many people are trying to use the facilities that exist right now. By having these small cell facilities, which are shown on the right, they'll be covering a very small area, maybe a 500 to 1,000 lineal feet on the ground for the person walking or occupying a building right there. And they'll be only about, say, 18 to 30 feet off the ground. And there'll be antennas. So the code that we wrote back in 1998 and updated didn't anticipate this small cell need. It didn't anticipate that we would have these lower facilities that could be put on traffic signals and light poles, and that there would need to be so many. It also didn't anticipate that we would have 4 or 5 providers out there that would each need to deploy their own network. And right now in Renton, for example, we know one of our providers who serves the Renton area has a gap in coverage, not a gap in coverage, excuse me, a capacity issue out around the landing, and it's one of their #1 areas to serve or to add this capacity. And so they've really been showing us their need in that area. The places where these are most needed are where people gather. They can be outside of stadiums, they can be in office buildings, dense housing, college campuses, shopping centers. So where there are a lot of people and everybody's got devices. We've all got smartphones, fitness trackers, there are health devices that might monitor your heart rate, or if you have a CPAP machine, it might send information back to your doctor, or an insulin pump or something like that. So everybody has multiple devices that use this technology, and that's why there's a need for it. These do have what is called line-of-sight technology. So the antenna has to pass the signal from one antenna to the other. And it has a very limited range. That's why they can only go 500 or 1,000 feet. So we needed to update our code. And we met with the wireless providers. We've met with staff. We've been working on this for actually a really long time, probably for at least a year. And I think we brought AHBL on late last spring because we realized we didn't know enough. We didn't know what we didn't know, and we needed some help, and they've really been invaluable to us. So we identified the areas of the code that we needed to update. We needed to make sure we had definitions in the code that dealt with this new technology, and we needed to update the use table in our zoning use table to say where they could be located. And we also needed to identify some of the processes to deploy this and to give an expectation of where they would be outright allowed and where they might need more review and public input. So what we did in the use table is we said, you're allowed to have these small cell facilities in all zones subject to an administrative conditional use permit, except if you comply with these preferred concealment techniques we've identified, you can just come and get a small cell permit and be on your way. So we make it really easy. And for those of you who may not be that familiar with a conditional use permit, basically it's a land use permit that we process where we look at an individual use or facility, and we look at it on the merits for where it's being located, where it's being proposed, and we evaluate it against specific criteria, and we may come up with specific conditions for that specific use. That's why it's called a conditional use. It will be allowed subject to these conditions if it's approved. So the other code revisions, we identified some of these preferred concealment techniques. If you did this, you could come get a small cell permit and be on your way. That's attaching to buildings and incorporating into a sign so you don't see it, attaching it to parking lot lighting that's not in the right-of-way, replacing utility poles or street lights to incorporate concealed facilities. So that would be the antennas would be in the actual shaft of the pole. The radio might be in the shaft or in the base, but you would, looking at it, you would see a light pole. You would not see this facility. You might see a little pole topper at the top that has some of the antennas too, but to you it would look like a light standard. It wouldn't look like a tower. In addition, it would allow the use of existing poles in certain areas as long as they weren't design districts or areas where we say you have to underground. And so if you were using an existing pole in an area other than a design district, it would be primarily a residential area, for example. Design districts are our commercial areas. There are office areas. There are mixed-use areas that have multifamily residential. So the code would also, as I said, allow for this single permit, this small cell permit, and it could be used to apply for up to 5 sites. We would batch those together under the one permit, and that would be for an area where there's service. Now, it wouldn't be spread out one up in the Highlands and one down in the valley. It would be 5 in a general area. And just to let you know, when we did go to the Planning and Development Committee, we had recommended that there could be up to 15 batched under a permit. But as we started really reviewing our processes and knowing that we try to expedite all of our permits and looking at our staffing levels, we decided to be a bit more conservative and recommend that there be a limit of 5 in a batch. And that's what we're putting forward tonight. And we are willing to revisit that if we find we're super efficient, and we could, through a code interpretation later, change that because it would be a procedural thing. In addition, I wanted to let you know that as part of our code revisions tonight, we're asking for a change to the fee schedule to charge a fee for the small cell permit. And so that's why the fee schedule is attached. So you could come in if you had these concealment techniques that were preferred by the city, you'd get your permit. If not, and you were a provider and you had an innovative approach that we hadn't considered or something that we can't really write code around, we would allow you to give us something called a concealment element plan. That's basically a way of saying, give us your proposal, tell us why it's great, give us illustrations, and show us how you're going to conceal these. They might be in a trash can, they might be in an information kiosk, they might be part of a wayfinding signage or some artwork. There may be ways of hiding this that we haven't thought about. And if we evaluated that through this conditional use permit and found it to meet our criteria, we would then approve it. So it's a matter of having more of citizen involvement, more public notification, instead of just outright approved. We're also giving you a couple of options to look at tonight. The ordinance, we gave you two different versions of the ordinance, and the difference is on page 26. And basically, we have option A and option B. And that's because we wanted some direction from you as far as something called standoff brackets. And that's what you're seeing in these photos here. There are situations where antennas can be mounted very close to the shaft of the light standard, and those are flush mounted. And then there's situations where they have to be offset from the light standard, and those are called standoff brackets. And that's what you see here, where the antennas are set about up to 12 inches off of the light standard. And that's so that the antennas can be tilted to have this line of sight technology so that they can communicate with one another. And we actually suggested that if this were to occur in residential areas, if you were to have standoff brackets, we realize that because they're not flush mounted, they would create more of an impact to the people who might be looking out their window and have a pole in front of their home, and that there should be the ability to go through a conditional use permit and have it evaluated in that way, have people have notification. And so we're suggesting that that standoff brackets not be allowed outright, that they require a conditional use permit, and that's option A. We talked about the flush mounting, which is attaching right to the pole. There's very little distance between the antenna and the pole. In that case, the purveyors or the providers could put their antennas at the very top of the pole, and they would have a little extension, as long as it didn't look like what we call an inverted lampshade or a lampshade or a giant Q-tip, as long as it was proportional. We would allow that. There is another option in your packet, which is option B. It would allow the providers to use those standoff brackets we were just showing you without needing a conditional use permit in areas that are other than design districts. So basically in a residential area. So option A is to require the conditional use permit in residential areas for standoff brackets. Option B is to allow them with just a small cell permit. So here's some illustrations. Hopefully this will make it a little clearer. This particular illustration shows what would be allowed under option A. Flush mounting of antennas and radios, so right next to the pole, or the pole toppers, as you see, and then you've got facilities either in the base or along the light standard or on the existing pole. And then option B, this shows an allowance for the standoff brackets as well. So you see those are separated from the pole. They're offset by about 12 inches. So again, option A, which is really keeping things close. Option B, which is allowing the standoff. So that concludes our presentation. It's actually a fairly complex ordinance. It's taken a long time to get together, but we really wanted to hit the high points and ask for your direction on those options. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Go ahead, Chip.
Council President and Council members, Chip Vincent, if I could just add just a little bit more context to the presentation that Jennifer and Brittany provided. I just wanted to share with you, you might be asking the question, why is this at the Committee of the Whole? when we heard this at the Planning and Development Committee on December 7th. So that's what I wanted to answer before any of you asked it. And that is because when we took this to the Planning and Development Committee and got a committee report from the Planning and Development Committee, the Planning and Development Committee made a change from what was originally recommended from the Planning Commission with respect to those standoff brackets, specifically in residential areas. And that is, the Planning and Development Committee was very concerned that those standoff brackets could have a visual impact on homes in residential areas. So they wanted to see the administrative conditional use to ensure that the neighbors were notified when one of these was coming in so that they could comment on it as part of the planning process. We heard from the industry after that meeting that they were very concerned about that as a component of the proposal moving forward. But because we heard about this after the Planning and Development Committee meeting, the best opportunity for us to really continue to provide for good communication between the committee, because the committee that we had in December at P&D is not the committee we have today, and some of the P&D members who are not on that committee anymore are on the committee of the whole. So I talked to Council President Prince. I said, how can we get this in front of everybody? And the answer is the committee of the whole. You have the past as well as the future Planning and Development Committee members here. So we just wanted to raise this as an issue to give the industry the opportunity to respond to the changes that were made at the December 7th Planning and Development Committee. And we didn't want to assume any decisions, and that's why Jennifer said there's two proposals there tonight. But for the staff, our recommendation is to advance the option that was recommended by the Planning and Development Committee. And that's only because, from our point of view, we're walking on this. We're crawling. We're not running yet. And we're going to learn a lot over the next year, but we're trying to err on the side of being cautious and kind of conservative and figuring this stuff out. We'll probably be back later this year with some amendments as we continue to evolve and learn and work through the process. But we thought it was better to err on the side of being conservative and erring on the side of public notice as we work through this process. But the industry would like to speak to you, so I think some of them are planning on testifying under audience comment tonight, and we didn't want to presume anything. So that's why you have the two options before you tonight.
Thank you, Chip.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Don.
Excuse me. Mine is a couple practical things that they're going to put these devices on telephone poles, light poles, and I'm making the assumption that they will end up on city light poles and PSE poles. So my question is how do they require electricity? And if so, how are they going to get that, and who's going to pay for it? And you know, how many? I mean, it seems, and what kind of a permit and permission do they have to get to stick one of these on a pole? I mean, I don't want to go down the street and see one of these on every light pole. I mean, and you know, we got those expensive light poles downtown that cost a lot of extra money, and somebody just come and say, oh, we got a permit, we're going to put up. So there has to be a little bit more to all this.
So yes, very good point. So any small cell provider has to get a franchise with the City of Renton for a small cell franchise if they want to deploy in our right-of-way. And if they're going in a design district, such as the downtown or along Rainier or somewhere like that, and they want to use our light poles, they would have to change them out. And they would have to make them look almost exactly the same, except they might be a tiny bit wider or taller to accommodate all the guts of that equipment within. And they would need to have power. And in fact, in talking with our streets folks, right now, those lights are only energized during the time when the bulbs are on and there's illumination. So there would have to be a second power connection to the pole that would possibly have to be metered separately, and the purveyor would have to pay for that. Brittany, do you have any other info on that?
No, that's about it. But as Jennifer stated, it's on the provider to make that work in the city's right of way. They have other opportunities on private property. Were they to locate in the public right of way, then they'd have to make it work as far as paying for their own electricity, acquiring a franchise agreement, acquiring a small cell permit that complies with the city's code.
Right.
Caroline, please.
So what you're saying is they're not just going to attach these to poles, they're going to replace the whole pole?
If they're in a design district, they'll have to replace the pole.
Okay. So my other question was, we received the correspondence from the wireless policy group.
Yes.
And they refer to prior drafts. So I'm assuming, because I'm new to this committee, that there were prior drafts of I don't know what they're referring to, and they say prior drafts be retained. They're asking for 10 feet versus 6 feet. Obviously, we're not going to go down that path today. I was just wondering what the prior drafts they're referring to were.
So there have been a number of drafts that have come along. There have been some model ordinances that we've been working with that have been developed by the purveyors and a consortium of cities. And we've been working with folks from Puget Sound Energy as well. And we're trying to find the sweet spot so that we can have the appropriate height of the pole, height of the antenna, and not overwhelm anything. So there, as Chip was saying, we expect we're going to have to come back and fine tune this once we really start working with it. But we wanted to make sure that we didn't have, if a pole is, say, 25 feet tall, we thought an additional extension of 10 feet might overwhelm it. And we thought 6 feet seemed like the sweet spot with the way we understood the technology.
Yeah, I agree with that. So what do you anticipate the conditional use permit activity would look like? Would that be a drain on the city, or is there going to be a high demand? Is it going to cost us in resources?
So the great thing about all the federal and state rules and regulations that are out there, they allow you to recover your actual costs. So it could be a drain on us, but we realize that if we're able to, it could be a drain on staff resources in terms of the volume of work, but we may be able to, we're anticipating using the money that would come in to devote a staff person to doing this work. We're hoping to do that.
Okay.
And we understand from talking to one of the network representatives or the industry representatives that we could expect anywhere from 400 to 600 of these within our city.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council? That is a lot. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'm concerned. What if a citizen says, hey, this thing, I'm just putting out radio waves or whatever it does, and it's pointed directly at my bedroom window or into my living room? What protection are we going to give to our citizens?
So as part of the conditional use permit application, they're required to provide a report that's been prepared by a radio frequency engineer that shows it is within the federal guidelines. And in addition, there is some flexibility, we understand, that maybe it doesn't go right here, but maybe if you shifted it 1 or 2 poles away, you still have the coverage. It doesn't necessarily have to be right here, but maybe they can shift it to the other side of the street or in front of, down on the corner or somewhere else.
And I guess my other concern is that with the fee schedule on these, it needs, it needs to be high enough that we're covering our cost. Because they're saving a lot of money by
Lumping them together.
lumping this thing together.
Go ahead, Chip.
Yeah, thank you, Council President Prince. Councilmember Person, we had 2 issues in CED on this. Our number 1 issue was a concern about blight. If we didn't create regulations, we could effectively have just absolute blight with a plethora of different agencies and organizations that want to do this. Once we work through that issue with the Planning Commission and with our consultant and with the public, the second issue is are we going to get run over in terms of staff costs and CED to process these if we're doing conditional use? So we actually worked very closely, I'm looking back at our city attorney, to ensure, and Jennifer referenced, there's an amendment to the fee schedule as part of this ordinance to ensure that we can collect the fees that are commensurate with the cost of processing them, so that for the staffing levels in CED, we don't go under with this, that we're able to maintain the staff support as well as our reasonable expectations for permit turnaround time. So that's why that fee's in there.
I hate to harp on this. I just want to be sure they're paying the electric bill. We got a $148,000 light bill this month alone just from our street lights and everything else. I'm against giving out free electricity.
Understood. So, because we have less than 30 minutes left and one more long presentation, I'm going to move us along to what does council feel as far as option A or option B? I have 2 committee reports here.
Well,
Please,
go ahead, yeah.
Councilmember McGurk.
Sure, thank you. So when I look at that picture of the standoff bracket, it to me doesn't look that like obstructive. If you look at the singular one, but then again, I also like the idea of having that public process, because that's my opinion personally, and not everyone in the public may feel that way. And the idea of 400 of these popping up around the city, I know it wouldn't be overnight. Certainly, I think to Chip's comments about taking some caution, I think makes some sense. I would hope that the public would embrace this new technology, that it will provide better connectivity. I would look forward to having that. But at the same point, I mean, and maybe this would be a question staff could answer as well. If I recall correctly from the committee meeting, the picture of the one single standoff bracket might not be the case. You could have multiple potentially on the same pole that would allow, and I could see that could be a little bit more obstructive potentially. And so, in that respect, I think taking the cautious approach makes the most sense.
I would agree with that. I think that we also don't want to be the one city in Puget Sound that doesn't have 5G. So, no, I think that you're going to have certain neighborhoods that are going to be concerned with poles and standoff lights, and I think it's just easier to go the other route where, the ones that are closer to the poles, it's not a problem, but the conditional use, and this is something we can always come back and revisit too.
Yeah.
So
So I think more
Yeah.
public process
I
versus.
think more public process, yeah.
Councilmember Perez, Person, or Witchy, any comments?
I would go with option A as well. And like they said in the letter, that if there is an issue where they need to have directional flexibility to make things work, they will make it work, and they can always apply for the conditional use permit. And I'm assuming that if we go with option A, that if they still need something on the option B list, they can apply for that, right?
Just to make it clear, option B is the one with the offset
Standoff bracket.
brackets. Thank you. And option A does not have those, so
Correct.
make sure we're saying the right thing. I think, Councilman Witchy, the way I was listening to you, I just want to make sure your vote is for option A. I think the others, I understood to be option B.
No.
No.
No, I think
we're
they're all
Everybody's option A?
Yeah.
We're all on
I think
A.
everybody's on A.
Yeah.
All right.
With option A, you can still have the standoff, you just.
Yeah, that was my
Yeah,
question.
You
Option
still-
A is the the offsets without a process.
Yes.
Yeah.
They automatically can put those on.
That's
No,
the
no,
B.
no,
No,
no, no,
option
no,
A
no.
is-
Option
Other way around.
A is
With a
flush.
process, B is without a process.
B is allowed as a small cell permit. No conditional use. A, you would need a conditional use permit to have standoff brackets.
Okay. All right, so I've got a committee of the whole report here. Committee of the whole has reviewed the information provided by staff regarding small cell and distributed antenna systems technology and recommends the adoption of the ordinance amending Title 4 regarding small cells and distributed antenna systems, option A. Everyone good with that?
Yes, sir.
All right,
Sure. Are you good with option A?
all right. Bicycle and Trail Master Plan Public Input. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much.
I guess I'm just concerned. I want this, don't get me wrong, but we have the banners that we put up.
Well, in those cases, they would put them inside is what
They
she was
put them
saying.
inside that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a design standard district, they have to match the pole.
That's, is this it? Oh, that's top line.
I get too practical on some of this stuff.
You ready for us, Leslie?
Good evening, Council President, members of the council. I want to thank you for providing us the opportunity to provide an update this evening. This will be our third update. I first want to give some introductions. We have a new project manager, Vanjie Garcia, with our Transportation Department, and she's been with the city for 2 months now, but she's not new to the city because she's a Renton resident, and she has dived right into the process and been a tremendous asset to the team. The third member of the team is Angie Matthias from Community and Economic Development, and she's helping us with the policy language and also will be with the SEPA process. So a quick overview. This is a process that started almost a year ago this month, in fact, and it's a plan update. It's the blueprint for future trail planning, for transportation, as well as for community services, for acquisition, development, and expansion. And in community services, we use this document to seek certification so that we can apply for state grant funding assistance. We had an extensive public outreach process, 3 technical advisory committee meetings, 3 open house meetings, 3 Parks Commission meetings. This is our 3rd Committee of the Whole meeting, an online questionnaire, and a companion online interactive map. Neither of those are statistically valid, but they're valuable information resources. And then we will be taking this through the SEPA process and going to Planning and Development Committee as well as the Planning Commission before we come back to Council for adoption. Our first open house and our second open house were in earlier in 2017. So we use multiple methods, Facebook and Twitter, posters and flyers, online and hardline or hard copy news, email blasts and web pages. Again, trying to maximize the public outreach process. We had Spanish and Vietnamese interpretive services at all open house meetings, and it's an iterative process. And when I say that, each time we go to the public, we put out new information, gather feedback to see if what we heard the first time that we presented to the public, if we're hearing the same thing or something entirely different. And we keep building upon that. And we don't really learn something that's absolutely new at that next open house or that next technical advisory committee meeting. So our third open house meeting was in November, and I think that it was probably the most fun for the public because we had lists of projects and maps up, and it was a large dot exercise. And so people were given 5 dots, and they got to put their dot next to the projects that they would like to see most in the city. And so this is another way of tracking what people would like to see, the demand. What would they like?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. I see that the most attendance that you have was in your first opening house, were 35 attendance.
Right.
For a city of the size of Renton, that is where more than 100,000 people, is that what you were expecting?
I would say that it's not out of the norm. I would say that probably the most recent experience with the Civic Core plan is out of the norm, and that's a difficult project to benchmark against. I would say that most of the city's public open house meetings, that 35 is standard, which is why we have a technical advisory committee with people who have expertise in trails, and we go to our Parks Commission. They're in touch with the community. And where we got the most feedback was on the online survey or it wasn't a survey, the online questionnaire and the interactive map. And we got a lot of feedback from those 2 sources.
Thank you.
So back to this slide, you can see what ranked the highest. I would say right behind what is projected on the screen, we had the Honey Creek Trail, right up there. Kenyon Dobson Park Trailhead, that's a trailhead to connect to the May Creek Trail, and the Sam Chastain Waterfront Trail. So Renton is really a hub of regional trails, 6 to be exact. The East Side Rail Corridor, Lake to Sound Trail, the Cedar River Trail, the Green River Trail and Interurban Trail, and the Sioux Creek Trail. And they all converge in the center, where that circle is. And this was a big discussion as part of our downtown civic core plan. It was also a large discussion with King County, because King County is the provider of regional trails. And so we had a whole separate set of meetings with them to try to make those connections to downtown, to the Renton connector, which was identified in the civic core plan. Also part of this plan, we looked at crucial intersections where these trails would connect up. The first being right across from Coulon Park, and there's options. These are not definitive designs at this point, but they will be incorporated in an appendix in the plan of how these trails can be connected in the future when the regional trail planning does occur. So we have 2 options near Coulon Park. One is a connection directly adjacent to Lake Washington Boulevard. The second is on the west side of the Burlington Northern Railroad and adjacent to the Puget Sound Energy. We have one option for the Logan Avenue South, and so this is a connection to the Renton connector. The Renton connector is the Burnett, connecting North Burnett Park to South Burnett Park. And this is making the connection from the Renton connector to the Lake Washington Loop Trail and then the East Side Rail Corridor across Logan Avenue. We have 2 options for how to make the connection from the Lake to Sound Trail to the Cedar River Trail. The Lake to Sound Trail follows the Burlington Northern Railroad right-of-way through Renton. That's where all the Boeing fuselages travel through Renton over to the Cedar River Trail. And this is option B. And option B is on the south side of Hauser Way. And finally, we have 2 intersection concepts for Burnett. And this is identified, some of these same elements are included in the downtown civic core. We had a lot of cross-planning going on. The first option shows, the first option shows a trail corridor along the Burlington Northern right-of-way up at the same level, separated, of course, from the railroad tracks. And the section option follows the road, which is adjacent to the neighborhood, and using that as almost like a neighborhood greenway, and then connecting over to Hauser Way. So we look for a connected system of regional trails, local connectors, and then neighborhood connectors, so that we have a comprehensive interconnected system. We also looked at different trail types, and this is something new to this plan. This is a new methodology, and it's level of traffic stress. Where we would like to be is a LTS, or level of traffic stress 1. A fine example of that would be the Cedar River Trail. It's a separated trail. Young children, anybody feels comfortable riding on that trail, bicyclists as well as pedestrians. The next would be a level of traffic stress 2. An example of that would be the Logan Avenue Trail. It's separated, it's a little bit narrower trail, but it's multi-use and people feel fairly comfortable traveling on that. A level of traffic stress 3, you're starting to get into where people are your more experienced riders, and they're riding on 5-foot wide bike lanes, such as the Lake Washington Boulevard. Those are people who are comfortable riding closer to traffic. And a level of traffic stress 4 Those are your hardcore bicyclists, and they are riding with the vehicles in the traffic lanes. Along with this comes different cross-sections, shared roadways. Again, that's where people are comfortable riding with the traffic. Neighborhood greenways. This is a new concept. It's using your neighborhoods, your lower traveled roadways for bicycles. And when we presented this to our Parks Commission, one of our avid cyclists on the Parks Commission indicated that she fully supported this concept because she's not comfortable riding, say, up on Northeast 4th where it's bike lanes and it's heavily traveled, but finding that level of traffic stress 1 or 2 using the neighborhood streets, riding on the streets, and then connecting up to something that's, a little bit higher demand where you've got the cars. Bike lanes, 5-foot wide bike lanes along roads. Buffered bike lanes, I don't think we have any of these in Renton, so they're separated but only with striping. You're pretty much on the same grade as riding with the vehicles, and protected bike lanes. And so there is actually a physical barrier there. It could be a planter, and I don't believe we have any of those in Renton at this point either. Side paths, again, this is similar to what we have along Logan Avenue. It's separated. You've got mixed use. Multi-use trails, similar to the Cedar River Trail, wider, heavily used. It's more like a regional trail. And soft surface trails. Honey Creek Trail, May Creek Trail, Springbrook Trail Boardwalk. Those are good examples. So we also looked at updating the policy language, similar to what we did when we adopted the Parks Plan. We didn't really have a lot of policy language in the former Trails and Bicycle Master Plan document. And so we developed some policy language, plans and goals, vetted this with the public, and one of the action items later will be to incorporate this into the citywide comprehensive plan. So we have continuity between adopted documents. We're in the process right now of project development. We talked about the bulleted items on the list that we're trying to accomplish. And in identifying the projects, we are using the goals and objectives, public input, the level of traffic stress. We want to develop an interconnected trail system, regional, local, and neighborhood trails, and use a variety of trail types and cross-sections that were presented here. And so we've developed some prioritization criteria, and I think that we have shown this on our prior presentations. We're still in the process of modifying this a little bit. Up on the screen here, we've got safety and comfort. I can tell you right now, we've modified that to safety and trail experience. And we've got a list of criteria. We have a couple bulleted items up here that we're just showing as a representation of how we'll be prioritizing the projects. Connectivity and accessibility is another criteria for prioritization. Equity. Need and demand. Need and demand is another new one. This is something that we need to prioritize against in order to receive state certification from our grant funding agency, and construction and implementation. Another future action item based on some of the new elements that we're proposing are potential roadway standard revisions. That's just potential. We'll be looking at that and how that compares to the adopted street standards, complete street standards. And this is our schedule for our next steps. In between March and May 21st, we'll be starting the SEPA process, and we'll be going to our Planning Commission and Planning and Development Committee, and then bringing it to you in May for consideration for adoption. Is there any questions?
Any questions from the council? Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Having no further business, the committee of the whole is adjourned.